Before the world burned under the crossfire of World War II, Adolf Hitler did not light the fuse with a single act, but with a precise sequence of steps, each one coldly calculated to bring Europe closer to the abyss. With every action he took, every speech in front of the masses, every pact signed in the shadows, Germany slowly broke the chains that had been imposed on it after the Great War. What began as a diplomatic challenge soon turned into a storm of war that swept away borders, ideologies, and millions of lives. This is the road to hell that shows how one man's ambition dragged the entire world into its greatest catastrophe. The Great Depression and the rise of Nazism. It all began with the global economic crisis of 1929, which struck an already battered Germany. The Weimar Republic, weakened by the humiliating conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, watched as unemployment and inflation devoured the hopes of millions. Factories shut down, endless lines formed for bread, entire families were reduced to begging. That was the everyday landscape, and when bread runs short, promises become weapons. On that soil, fertile ground for desperation, Hitler planted his message. He did not invent hatred. He harvested it while the rest of the world underestimated him.
The Hitler government is underestimated in the West, as it's underestimated in Germany, because governments have only lasted about a year, there are 6 million people unemployed, and this figure of Hitler seems faintly ludicrous to seasoned statesmen in the West with his marches and Charlie Chaplin moustache.
But the Nazi leader had a plan. His first step was to point to clear culprits. The Jews, the communists, the corrupt elites. He offered a common enemy to unite the nation. With words that mixed resentment and redemption, he turned discontent into political force. Millions traded their vote for the illusion of order, believing that a strong leader could rescue Germany from misery. Thus, the crisis broke democracy and opened the door to dictatorship. Nazism was not born from abundance, but from need. Hitler comes to power. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He did not arrive with tanks, but with eloquence and a propaganda machine that turned resentment into obedience. From the very first day, peace stopped being an objective and became an obstacle. The Reichstag, which was supposed to be the heart of democracy, turned into the chamber where freedom would bleed out. With the burning of the parliament came the measures to fight the supposed external enemy, and civil rights were suspended. In a matter of weeks, opposition parties were banned, the free press was silenced, and the police turned into an instrument of the regime. With a single decree, German democracy ceased to exist. Hitler promised to break the chains, and the people handed him the key. Every speech was a war drum that did not yet sound in the fields but already echoed in the hearts of those who dreamed of a great Germany once again. The Führer had consolidated his power, and the darkness was only beginning to fall over Europe. Recovery of the Tsar. On January 13th, 1935, the Tsar, a territory occupied by the United Kingdom and France under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, went through a change the world did not expect. More than 90% of voters chose to return to Germany in a plebiscite supervised by the League of Nations.
The Nazis employed intimidation and bullying to achieve a favourable result. Opponents were kidnapped, beaten and killed. The result of the referendum was an overwhelming majority to rejoin Germany. It was Hitler's first big success. The Tsar, with its valuable industries, would rejoin Germany.
This was a victory measured not in bullets, but in ballots. Hitler presented it as unquestionable proof that his regime had undeniable popular support. The plebiscite was a red carpet rolled out toward expansion, and when the world watched, it barely raised an eyebrow. On March 1st, 1935, the Tsar was officially reincorporated into the Third Reich.
Rarely has Hitler received a more fervid welcome than was accorded him when he appeared, an unexpected visitor, at Saarbrücken during the elaborate celebrations which marked the passing of Saar territory from the rule of the League of Nations to Germany. Enthusiasm reigned everywhere and reached its height as the Führer drove in his car through the streets of the town.
That day, the map of Europe began to change color. For Hitler, it was more than a territorial triumph. It was a perfect rehearsal of how to move forward without firing a single shot, of how to turn a political act into a symbol of reunification and legitimacy. The victory reinforced his image as a leader capable of returning lost lands without resorting to war, at least for the moment. Hitler understood that the world would not react to a peaceful reunification, and that emboldened him.
Rearme
rearmament
clandestino
and
y militarización.
With no consequences in sight after recovering the Tsar, Hitler went further. Despite the strict restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, he launched a massive rearmament in secret. Factories that produced civilian tools began manufacturing parts for panzer tanks. Mechanical workshops were transformed into arsenals. In hidden hangars, engineers designed aircraft that would one day make up the Luftwaffe. Thus, the roar of engines replaced the silence of defeat. Under the guise of sports clubs and associations, thousands of young Germans received military training. Every soldier trained in the shadows was a direct challenge to Europe. Every plane that took off was another step toward the coming storm of war. Eventually, Hitler abandoned secrecy and openly announced the restoration of compulsory military service and the creation of the Luftwaffe. U-boat submarines began to leave the shipyards like steel shadows.
It's fairly clear that he's breaking the Treaty of Versailles. He's creating an air force which is prescribed. He's talking about the need for a larger German navy, and then in March 1935 he announces the introduction of conscription, and the Treaty of Versailles had said that you could only have an army of 100,000 men in Germany.
Turning a deaf ear to all protests, the war machine of the Reich roared back to life, and it did so with a speed that defied all expectations. Hitler had turned the trap of defeat into a springboard toward war. The reoccupation of the Rhineland. On March 7th, 1936, German troops crossed the Rhine and entered the Rhineland, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact. The Führer knew it was a dangerous gamble. His soldiers had orders to withdraw if France or the United Kingdom responded with force. However, there was no response. the silence of Allied guns was Hitler's green light.
The Versailles Treaty had left Germany weak. If Germany rearmed, the Allies could invade. Hitler had called their bluff. He'd pulled out of disarmament talks. He'd brought back army training for all German men. And in '36, he'd marched into the Rhineland, a buffer with France where no German troops had been allowed since 1990.
France, paralyzed by its internal political crisis, did not move a single soldier. The United Kingdom, clinging to appeasement, limited itself to diplomatic protests. Thus, the Rhineland became the first heartbeat of a military heart that was starting to pump again. Hitler's greatest risk turned into his first major victory.
I think most historians now agree that the reoccupation of the Rhineland was the last chance of stopping a major war. Hitler marches into the Rhineland in March 1936, and it's been kept open. The French wanted to occupy it themselves, but they weren't allowed to by the British and the Americans at Versailles. But it's kept demilitarized because it's essentially the front door to Germany. This is the route through which the French army would march.
The region, strategically vital, was once again militarized by Germany. With every fortification raised and every soldier deployed, the Reich strengthened its position against its neighbors. The Rhineland was the dress rehearsal for military expansion, proof that audacity, combined with the inaction of one's adversaries, could yield spectacular results. In this way, Hitler not only recovered a territory, he also gained the certainty that Europe was not ready to stop him. Annexation of Austria, Anschluss. In March 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border without meeting resistance. Austria also fell without a single shot being fired. In Vienna, the streets filled with flowers, applause, and flags bearing swastikas. Many saw the arrival of the Reich as a long-awaited reunification, while others kept silent, aware that the joy in the streets was hiding the end of sovereignty.
Whether German troops crossed into Austria before they were invited or not is now only an academic and unimportant point. They crossed and met with no opposition. Instead, they found welcome and rejoicing among sympathizers, and those who dissented either stayed away or feigned enthusiasm. Removing the frontier barrier at Kufstein becomes almost a ritual. It goes to the museum or perhaps to the bonfire. Epitome of the great bloodless revolution which has agitated the world, German troops crossed the Danube at Passau.
A country disappeared from the map in a single day, absorbed by the Nazi political and military machine. International protests were weak and purely symbolic. Neither France nor the United Kingdom was willing to confront the Führer over a peaceful annexation. Hitler presented it as proof of his historic destiny and the power of his leadership. In a matter of days, the Third Reich expanded its territory and added human, economic, and strategic resources. The message was clear. The world was not willing to stop him, and every successful step only reinforced the image of an unstoppable leader.
The demonstration was an organized one. Stormtroopers and Austrian Nazis were everywhere, stimulating a peace-loving people in cheering and accepting the self-styled leader.
Sudeten Crisis and the Munich Agreement. In September 1938, Hitler set his sights on the Sudetenland, a Czechoslovak region with a large German population. He claimed these citizens were suffering discrimination and demanded their annexation. The threat of war loomed over Europe, but the Führer had a plan to placate his rivals.
At the absolute last moment, when Chamberlain is in the midst of a speech in the House of Commons, talking about the preparation of war, the telephone in the Foreign Office rings, and it is the British ambassador in Germany saying that Hitler is inviting the great powers, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, for a conference at Munich to find a peaceful solution. And that leads to the Munich Agreement, which
At the Munich conference, the United Kingdom and France gave in to Hitler's demands without even consulting Czechoslovakia. Every signature on that document was a betrayal of that country. In this way, the German leader understood that threats were cheaper than bullets and that through blackmail he could obtain what he wanted.
Next, I want to say that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace.
But Chamberlain could not have been more mistaken. The world avoided war only to postpone it for a few months. Czechoslovakia lost its most important defensive system and was left exposed. Hitler presented the outcome as a triumph of self-determination, when in reality it was a clear act of international pressure. The Munich Agreement did not bring peace, but the illusion of it. And while the great powers celebrated having saved Europe, in the corridors of German power, the next move was already being planned. Invasion of Czechoslovakia. On March 15, 1939, the lie of Munich was exposed on the streets of Prague. Hitler broke his word and sent troops to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia, with immediate success.
Here and there, citizens of German origin give the conquerors a welcome, but Czechs either watch sullenly or stay away. Presently, from a window of the castle, you may catch a glimpse of Hitler himself contemplating his new conquest.
Prague fell without any significant shot being fired, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was born. It was no longer reunification, but conquest. The Führer had stopped hiding his ambitions behind the idea of uniting Germans. This time, the occupied population was not majority German. Hitler showed that his promises were double-edged weapons, useful to buy time and then discard. The Western powers understood too late that this was not about historic claims, but about a campaign of unlimited expansion. The occupation was a strategic blow. Germany now controlled key industrial resources and a central geographical position in Europe. The Munich Pact, once sold as a diplomatic victory, was reduced to a bitter joke. Hitler was no longer playing the chess game of politics. He was deploying his pieces for war, and his next move would be the most surprising of all.
Finally, the day came. Like a good murder mystery, no one had guessed how it would happen. Molotov and von Ribbentrop got together, and the Nazis and communists signed a pact. It was a betrayal by the communists, and the world was plunged into war.
The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. On August 23, 1939, the world was stunned. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Two irreconcilable ideological enemies shook hands to divide Europe between them. In a secret protocol signed far from cameras and microphones, they agreed to carve up Poland in two and establish spheres of influence in the Baltic countries and Eastern Europe. Ideology gave way to strategy. For Hitler, it meant securing the Eastern Front, allowing him to attack westward without fear of a war on two fronts. For Stalin, it meant gaining time to rearm and expand his control over the region. The enemy became a partner, even if only temporarily. The pact was the last cog to fall into place before the collision. It was a fragile and cynical alliance of convenience, one that would last just long enough to ignite the most devastating war in history. The hateful speeches were briefly put on hold. The priority for now was dividing the spoils. Europe was about to witness the price of this poisoned embrace.
La invasión de Polonia.
And And so, September 1st, 1939, arrived the day Poland woke up to the roar of panzer tanks. The greatest war of the century began with a lie. A supposed Polish attack on a German radio station, staged by the Reich itself, served as the pretext for the invasion.
The German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II. Poland's 34 million inhabitants, crushed, scattered, and enslaved. Tens of thousands of square miles of territory shrink before the movement of lightning-armored columns. Poland and the world learn the meaning of a grim new word: Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, tore through borders in a matter of hours, combining the swift advance of tanks with massive aerial bombardment. Polish cities burned while columns of refugees fled along roads, turned into easy targets. In the east, Stalin waited for his moment to fulfill his part of the pact. The fire Hitler had lit would soon engulf the world. On September 3rd, the United Kingdom and France declared war on Germany. It was the end of appeasement and the beginning of a conflict that would soon devour continents. The flames of Warsaw would be the omen for an entire continent. World War II had begun, and nothing could stop it now. What for years had been a carefully calculated rise to power was turning into an unstoppable storm. When Adolf Hitler completed each of these steps, the world found itself on the edge of a precipice with no way back. Nothing was accidental. Every decision, every speech, and every move was part of a calculated strategy to challenge the order established after the Great War. Thus, Europe was led almost without resistance into World War II, a conflict that devoured borders, cities, and millions of lives. What some at the time saw as isolated incidents or legitimate maneuvers were in fact the gears of a machine advancing toward destruction. Appeasement and the passive stance of the democratic powers did not stop the threat. They fed it. Perhaps if Europe had acted firmly at any one of those moments, history might have taken a different course. But when the last domino fell, it was already too late. The continent was engulfed in flames, and the rest of the planet would soon burn with it. Thus, we come to the end. If you like this video, we'll be waiting for you in our next installment of War Documents.